More than 21 million Americans had personal information stolen from government files.
Breaking word coming down late this afternoon of what sources are telling us is a massive Chinese hack of U.S. government computers.
Today, I'm going to talk about OPM.
Had a data breach.
OPM, or the Office of Personnel Management, is the HR department for the US government. They're responsible for creating policies, standards, and importantly, security vetting for US government employees. Back in 2015, the Chinese government hacked into OPM and stole millions of records. This included vetting files, fingerprint data, really sensitive information about people.
Yeesh, that's a lot of data.
Prior to this attack, all the warning signs were there. The US government had warned all of their departments about the increasing threat from hacking. Hundreds of individual warnings had been issued. Unfortunately though, the state of security at OPM was lacking. Because of the significance of the attack, the US government did a big inquiry, and that culminated in a 250-page report being written about what happened and what happened at OPM that allowed it to take place. It's what I've used as the source for most of the information in this video, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. Now, if you're not familiar with security vetting, it happens in the private and the public sector. In the private sector, that's usually a reference check, maybe some background information on an individual. But in the public sector, and particularly if you're going to access sensitive or secret information, it's quite an invasive check. And the purpose is to ensure that there's no way that an individual could be blackmailed or coerced into giving up information easily. And this is exactly the sort of information that an intelligence agency would love to have on their enemy. Now, when you think about intelligence agencies and spies, you probably think about things like the NSA, GCHQ, eavesdropping, hacking into mobile phones and laptops and computers. But there's another side to intelligence, the traditional side, what James Bond does, and that's human intelligence, or HUMINT. And this is learning about people, gaining their trust, and then getting information from them. So, imagine you're an intelligence agency and you want to recruit spies in a government of an enemy. A fantastic data set to use would be their vetting data. You would know all about them, their life history, their weaknesses, their strengths, and anything that you might be able to leverage to trick them or coerce them into giving you information.
Smart move.
But before we dive into the breach, we really should talk about context. And I'm not trying to defend OPM here, but at that time, the US government was growing significantly, and anybody that wanted to work in a particularly sensitive area would have to go through that vetting. If they fail to keep up with that, they're literally stopping people joining government, being able to do sensitive security work.
No pressure.
Now, this breach is split into two parts. Firstly, Hacker 1 and then Hacker 2. In March 2014, the US notified OPM that they had seen suspicious activity coming from their network.
Everybody panic!
OPM then took that information and they monitored the attacker that was in their network for 2 months. Now, you're probably thinking, why not just kick them out? Why not eradicate the attacker as quickly as possible? Well, I kind of understand what they're trying to do here. There's a risk that if you rush during incident response and you take the data you have and you try and remove the attacker from your network, you might not have seen all the places where they have persistence, backdoors, other ways that they can get in. It's quite a smart move by OPM not to rush, but to take their time, understand the extent of the intrusion, and then remove the hacker. However, during this time, it did allow the attacker to export a lot of technical data about the OPM network. So during this time, they didn't get to the personal data, the really sensitive vetting data, but they got to a lot of manuals about IT services, systems that OPM had. And it's described in the report as literally a roadmap to the different OPM systems.
Not ideal.
But also, OPM didn't have great security, so they didn't have all the logging they would have wanted. So really, they've got some confidence in what was stolen during this time by Hacker 1, but they're not sure. Also during this time, the hacker got domain admin for the OPM environment, so they probably had access to all systems. During the inquiry, they identified that the hacker may have been in their systems since July 2012. So really, there is no idea how much data may have been lost in that time. So if that's Hacker 1, there's also the second hacker, Hacker 2. And in May 2014, Hacker 2 entered the environment and started putting backdoors in the OPM infrastructure.
Oh shit, here we go again.
After watching the first hacker for those 2 months, OPM decided it was time to eradicate them, and they planned an operation that they called the Big Bang.
Big Bang.
By this stage, lots of US government departments were involved, DHS, NSA, and the FBI. And on the 27th of May 2014, OPM executed the Big Bang, and they thought they had eradicated HackerOne from their network. After the Big Bang, the US CERT were helping OPM try and improve their security, and they issued quite a damning report about the state of security at OPM at that time. And this had 14 recommendations, all around things like MFA, segmentation, patching, fairly sensible security work. Part of the hardening that was mandated was increasing the use of MFA for all users and especially privileged users. And fun fact, back in 2009, OPM have purchased 5,000 PIV cards. They're MFA that you use with your keyboard with an access card. They just hadn't deployed them. So with HackerOne gone, OPM thought they were in the clear. Hacker2 remained in the network. They started moving around. They gained domain admin. And in July 2014, they started exporting OPM data. Interestingly, the command and control that Hacker2 was using for access to OPM were websites that were made to look like they were legitimate OPM websites, like OPM Learning and OPM Security. But in the registration details of those websites, they were using characters from the Avengers. So they had Steve Rogers and they had Tony Stark as well. And that was used as an indicator to find other domains that were related to this breach. And it wasn't until April 2015 that OPM finally identified that Hacker2 was in their systems. So the initial access for Hacker2, they believe, was through the compromised account of a third party that worked with OPM, and that they were just able to use that to VPN into the OPM network. Now, here the story gets a bit strange. OPM bought in Cylance, who at the time were a leading EDR vendor in that space. So EDR is endpoint detection and response. It's agents you can put onto machines that look for suspicious and malicious activity. Now, at the time, there were two flavors of Cylance EDR. One that would detect, so would identify malicious activity and tell you about it, but would do nothing. And the other would protect, so it would identify something that's suspicious or malicious, and it would delete it, quarantine files, kill processes, basically take action. So on the 17th of April 2015, OPM rolled out the Cylance EDR product, but only in detect mode. And in the report, it says basically they were just really worried that it's going to break systems or, interestingly, delete files that they then needed for forensics, which was odd because that's not how EDR works. So one day later, on April the 18th, the Cylance dashboard lights up like a Christmas tree.
So bright.
It's identified 39 high priority alerts that need investigation. The scale of the compromise becomes clear. OPM have just been completely owned by the attacker. But it wasn't until April the 25th that OPM finally turned on Cylance in the protect or auto protect mode, where it would go and remove files and quarantine files as needed. And at that point, it identified 1,180 suspicious files. Several days later, the attacker was eradicated from the OPM network.
You kicking me out? Yes, I'm kicking you out.
So to recap, at this point, the Chinese state have had two intrusions into OPM, HackerOne and Hacker2, and Hacker2 have been able to steal millions of personnel files, fingerprint data, vetting forms for US government employees. So following this, the US government kicked off their 12-month inquiry into the OPM breach. And this is where we get some really rich detail about how the attack came about and the culture within OPM at the time. And this is something, when I see data breaches in the news, we so often don't see. Often you'll hear people talk about the technical reasons for a breach, what an attacker did, the really detailed TTPs. But often I find it's more interesting to hear about how did that organisation get to the point where they had a culture that just neglected security, causing a breach of this magnitude. The report highlights that OPM were first warned about cybersecurity in 2005. Fast forward to 2014, security is a big thing across this sector. There's lots of breaches. One of OPM's contractors had a breach. Two of their healthcare providers had a breach. Around this time as well, you had Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, big defence contractors also having security incidents. During a routine inspection in 2008 into OPM security, the US government found it had serious concerns about the state of which OPM were operating. Again in 2009, another inspection had serious concerns about OPM security. In 2010, there was another inspection into OPM security, and again it raised serious concerns. I'm going to read a direct quote from it here. which is it remains to be seen whether senior management is fully committed to strong IT security governance for the long term.
Oh, damn!
In 2012, OPM created the Office of the Chief Information Officer. In the report, it talks about the security people that would help support that, and OPM designated individuals in different teams and departments to be security champions to try and improve security. But these folks had no experience in security, and they reported to the people responsible for those systems, whose, as I talked about earlier, their focus was mainly around availability. Another report at this time, during an inspection of OPM, has another damning quote. I'll read it for you. They tried to fix security, but ineffective leadership and poor decision making plagued the agency.
That is damning evidence.
The report also highlights that OPM was spending the least of their peers, the lowest spend in security across the US government. Another interesting quote from the inquiry, they had in the head of security and the CIO as well, and they claimed that because OPM systems were so antiquated, they were so old, that it probably helped them from a security perspective because hackers wouldn't know how to operate them.
Centuries-old technology.
Also during the inquiry, OPM really played down the significance of the information stolen by HackerOne during that first breach. It's actually quite breathtaking when you look at it. There's a list in the report of all the files that were stolen. Some of these are technical details of super sensitive government systems, and they really just dismissed it to say, well, it's not personal data.
Move along, nothing to see here.
Do you remember earlier I mentioned those two domains being used for C2, the OPM Learning and the OPM Security domains? Well, they were detected using a tool called WebSense. It's basically a web proxy and inspects web traffic. Well, OPM had that for quite a while. OPM first got WebSense in June 2014, but if you fast forward 1 year, the deployment's only 60% done. And in the report, they state that that slow progress was due to balancing usability and security. The report also looks into the use of the Cylance EDR, and amazingly, its deployment was delayed because of what the report states is internal bureaucracy and politics on the desktop. So I take that to mean that probably internal IT teams weren't comfortable with deploying more agents to their systems, so they blocked the progress of that deployment. So what lessons can we learn from the OPM breach? Well, where to begin? I think firstly, the importance of privileged identity management or privileged access management. In both hacks, the attackers got domain admin, and that allows you to do so much in an environment. Find those identities, remove them if you can, reduce that attack surface, make sure they've got strong credentials, make sure they're not extensively used, and if you can, control them using something like a PAM tool to lock them away and auto-rotate them and manage their usage. MFA comes up constantly in the report, and as you read through what the attacker did, you can just see there's so many opportunities where MFA would have really slowed them down. Also, restricting lateral movement using tools like Windows Firewall or other segmentation tools to make it difficult for an attacker to use common protocols to move around an environment. But most importantly on the MFA for any external access. It was the compromise of the supplier's VPN access that allowed Hacker2 into the environment. And that, even back then, MFA was just normal. But if you can only do a little bit of MFA, make sure you MFA any external access. In the case of the supplier being compromised, they never knew or they never disclosed how that happened. But I suspect all the attacker needed was one username, one password, and they were onto the OPM network. And that's because there was no MFA to slow them down. I think another interesting lesson from this is around tooling. If you buy tools, make sure you use tools. OPM in some places with Cylance, they also had a SIEM tool, they had WebSense, they had some of the tech that could have helped them move quickly and stop this attack. But deployments were slow, there's bureaucracy, there's politics. So if you're going to invest in tooling, make sure you've got a plan of how it's going to be deployed and make sure you do fully deploy it, or at least deploy it as much as you can. Reading through the report, it made me also think about things like canary tokens. These are fake documents you can leave around an environment that, when opened, trigger alarms. Word of caution with those, there are ways that attackers can detect them before they even open them, so they can't be fully relied on. But in this case, it sounds like there was somebody rampaging around their environment, looking at lots of data, and that could have been a really cheap, easy way to detect something suspicious going on. I think another lesson is, where does security sit as a priority for our organisations? It's not explicit in the report, but it comes through to me that security just wasn't up there on the priority list for OPM. And it makes me reflect on how we do that within our own organisations. Where does security sit? Where is it prioritised? If we've got external oversight as well, so if we work in finance, the 3 lines of defence model, we might have auditors, we might have risk teams. What's their engagement and what's their capability to really challenge and support what's happening in security? In the case of OPM, they had plenty of warning signs, plenty of challenge, yet nothing really happened to improve things. Another takeaway is cyber threat intelligence. At the time of this breach, the sector was having lots of different cyber attacks. Lots of organisations were impacted, and the tactics, techniques and procedures being used weren't really that exotic. They were well known, they were understood, and most of the things listed in the OPM report aren't really that new. So having a good understanding of the threat landscape, who might want to attack you, how they might want to do that, is a really valuable tool in defence. Another lesson is governance and having good governance. What the inquiry and the report really show to me is that OPM didn't have good governance of their security. You can have poor security, but be aware of it and have a plan of how you're going to fix it through good governance and risk management. That's all I've got time for today. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you again soon.